Hello, I'm waiting here for Scott Ellaway, a good friend of mine, and unfortunately for him, it's quite early in the morning, so I'm hoping that he'll show his face quite soon. But he did suggest the time. Obviously, we're +8 hours here in London, so it will be 9 a.m. for Scott. So I see he's here, so he is awake. Technology will be with us today, but hopefully you're all okay. It's a lovely day here in London. It's been beautiful, and we're connected up with LA. Hi.
Hi, how are
Oh,
you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. I have some coffee here, so that's helping with the morning start. But, when you asked me to do this, I thought, it's Maxine. Who can say no to Maxine?
No, I'm really thrilled because we did something together right at the literally it was the first sort of project I was involved with at the beginning of lockdown, and suddenly it just seems like that was ages and ages ago, and and now you're also in LA. So can you tell us about your move? So you went from
Yeah,
New York.
yeah, it's really changed. But first, just before the whole, when we last saw each other, if I was to measure how long my hair has grown since then, hence why I'm wearing this cap, it's quite something. So that just gives you an idea about the amount of time that it's been. Um, Los Angeles was always going to be on the cards for me at some point, and the reason for that is that I have an education project that works very closely with California public schools, and we're currently working on something for them in 2021. And when lockdown happened, as you know, I mean, um, musicians' schedules went out the window, and I had a call from my manager and said, well, don't expect to conduct for a little while. And so that completely disappeared. But what did happen is that I then had a call probably, half an hour later from the Department of Education in California saying, well, we need something for our 25,000 public schools.
Mhm.
What can you provide us now? And so that really changed everything for me and allowed me to think about the possibility of making a move over from New York to Los Angeles. And quite frankly, what better time, if you can do it in a safe and considered way, to make a move when other parts of your schedule are drawn out and you actually have time to do it. Because moving is one of the most stressful things, as you know, you can probably do. So I bit the bullet and I was like, okay, here we go. That's what happened.
Yeah, at least it didn't clash with anything, or you knew that nothing was just going to suddenly fall into the diary. You could perfectly choose the time and just think, I have nothing, I have nothing else to do right now. Why not just get over there? Because I suddenly saw these pictures of you in it, and I thought, wow, that is really something. How long had you been in New York? Because that was a long time.
Yeah, I'd had 8 amazing years in New York. And I can tell you, if there was not a reason to leave it, I would have been there till my dying day. And this is the story I hear from many friends who have reached that point of 7 or 8 years. You either decide that you're going to stay for your life or you're going to make a move. But New York was a wonderful 8 year period. And, I had 3 years, first of all, right in the heart of things up at Columbus Circle, and was very lucky. I could see Carnegie Hall from my bedroom window. The Lincoln Center was just, up the road where we've met many times.
Yeah.
And, and it was great. And I'd go running around the park and, yeah, it was really in the thick of things. And then I had 5 years out in Brooklyn Heights, which is just across the Brooklyn Bridge by the water. Reminded me a lot, actually, of parts of the UK in which I'd lived, and was much more sort of homely there, and gave me a little time out of the city. So I sort of had the best of both worlds. But yeah, 8 amazing years. I can't believe it.
Yeah, because I remember us meeting up by Lincoln Center, and it was just, and obviously maybe it was the last time I saw you. Might have been in London. I get mixed up now for when we lives cross over. But of
Yeah,
course, we would have met when you first conducted the LSO. So what year?
yeah.
When was that?
Yeah, so I first worked with the LSO in 2016, and I first worked with you at the LSO a year later, I
A
think it
year
was in
later, I
2000.
think. Yeah.
So I mean, time flies, and if we'd been in London, we would have gone to somewhere like the Jagged Hare or something like that, right? And
Yeah.
got a pint or some wine or some good food. I love that place, and I miss it. I hope it's doing okay. Shout out to the Jagged Hare. A
Yeah,
good
it was
place to.
closed. It is closed, but I'm sure it will be okay with all, residents around, and
Yeah,
fingers crossed when it opens again.
yeah. I wonder if they're one of those places that are doing takeout.
No, they're not. Believe me, I know
Uh,
ones that are obviously living above, right here above the shop in the Barbican. I'm well aware of, of which restaurants I can get proper, food from their kitchens when. So I mean, luckily it is happening more and more, and I just think that's great because I want to be able to support local businesses, and it is a really really tough time for them, but of course it has that sort of, it's great to be able to sit in, have a chat with someone over a nice meal. And I remember us, yeah, I remember us doing that the last time you were here.
yeah,
But I think the 2016 first project with the orchestra was something quite small.
it was.
Was it a chamber group?
Yeah. So it was, in a way, it was actually for me a little more scarier working with a smaller group than with the big orchestra because these were all the principals of the orchestra,
Mm.
and it meant that one had their full attention completely on you and what needed to be done, and in true British fashion, everything is done very fast and very quickly, which it's one of the things that I love about British orchestras, that you can rehearse the most technically challenging piece really within 2 hours and 40 minutes and have a break and then go do it if you want. And in this case, we were doing a live broadcast back to the US, to public schools in the US, and we were focusing on a piece by Esa-Pekka Salonen called Catch and Release, which is very challenging, particularly for the clarinet part. And Andrew Mariner did an incredible job live on air without any possibility to retake. And in addition to that, not only had we rehearsed that and we had rehearsed a run through with it scripted, but I also asked two of the LSO players to speak to camera and answer questions on air. So Andrew Mariner did one of them and Neil Percy did the other. And they did it incredibly well. But the experience for me was very special because these have been players that I've known since I was a teenager by coming to concerts and things, and so having the opportunity to first work with them was very special. They all had opinions about the music, which was great, and I was able to listen to those and let them play as they wanted to play this wonderful music. And I knew that it would be an orchestra that I would hope I could work with again, and so that's how the Schubert came about.
Yeah.
And the Schubert for me has, lots of wonderful memories, but I remember watching some old video footage with the LSO, with John Georgiadis leading, with Leopold Stokowski playing that piece. And I'd actually gotten to know John Georgiadis a little bit when I was at university. And so I sort of feel in a way that I have been able to tap some memories back to the LSO early days about what it was like.
Oh, that's fantastic. Because, well, John, I'm reading a book called Bow to Baton. I'm going through it very slowly, which amazingly, somebody I met through Twitter and lives in Edinburgh and always comes to the Edinburgh Festival, to the LSO. And we usually have a chat at the stage door. And this is the sort of amazing thing in a way about how social media can bring people together. And he has sent me this book through the post to the LSO, and it's fascinating. And it's John Georgiadis, basically an autobiography about his life. And then sort of, I've got to the point now where he's in the LSO, and then it's obviously going to go on to when he's become a conductor. And I've always found it very interesting because he's sort of from my hometown. So when I was up, yeah, he's sort of from the Bromley kind of area. So he had, nephews in the same kind of growing up in the same youth orchestras and things like that. And he came to conduct us on a sort of one of these, you know how it goes in your sort of hometown youth orchestra, everything is, you know, structured, and sometimes there's nothing massively memorable. But he came to do Carmina Burana, which is
Uh,
obviously was an absolutely huge thing for us to do. Already a huge piece, but with somebody who was like famous was incredible. So I've always had quite an interest in his life, just, you know, remembering from that time and thinking, wow, it's John Georgiadis. And actually I wish I'd had the sort of chance to ever know him as a leader and such, because the only work I'd ever really done with him in the profession was some New Year's concerts with the LSO, which he used to take, which he used to do with a great amount of humour. But I always felt very sorry for him because, of course, New Year's Eve and New Year's Day is probably not the days that professional musicians really want to be working. So, you know, you've either got people with huge hangovers or they're sort of thinking about what they're about to go out and do on New Year's Eve. But it was, yeah, that's amazing that you have that kind of journey thinking about him when you came to us with that project.
well, you know, the orchestra has changed so much, of course, since, you know, John was playing all those years ago. But to truly know an orchestra is to go back into its history and to see where it was back in the early days. And of course, for me, you know, with the LSO, you know, anybody in the UK, you could probably say, talk about the wonderful Morecambe and Wise sketch with Andre Previn. It's
Yes.
legendary. You know, it was a time that the orchestra was playing on TV, I think, once a week.
Yeah,
And, you
Friday.
know, I wanted to hear about those moments. What was it like? What was the orchestra like? What was the orchestra like to conductors? You know, all of those types of things. And also about the repertoire, how the repertoire was played back then, with these, you know, very famous conductors of their time. And so we were able to talk about that. And that was very, very valuable for me. So I felt there was a sort of a very long look back from my own sort of time of growing up. Then the LSO was one of the first orchestras I came and saw rehearse. And the LSO was transformational for me when I was finishing up at university. As you know, whenever you get to that stage of thinking, oh, how do I become a professional musician?
Mm-hmm.
It's a challenging time. And I was just finishing up at Oxford University where I read music. It was 2005, and I was in the midst of exams, and I knew that I needed to do something to make some sort of transition. I had no idea what, and I was invited to come to an LSO discovery session at LSO St. Luke's, where Michael Tilson Thomas was speaking.
Oh, okay.
So, you know, I attended that, and I got chatting to Michael, and I just had a funny feeling, a gut feeling that this would be somebody that could maybe help. And so we talked a little bit after the session, and then I thought, you know what, I've got to go to the rehearsal and the concert now that followed that. So
Yeah.
I telephoned the LSO and said, can I come? Can I come? I said, yes, okay, fine, come along. And I came to that, and I came to the rehearsal, and the most amazing thing ever happened. I tell you, I must have had a lot of guts, but it was at the end. It was at the end of the rehearsal, and Michael walked off stage, and I followed him. And it must have been a sort of a quieter time, because usually you'd have a lot of people around asking questions, or players asking questions.
Yeah.
Anyway, he walked into his dressing room. Somehow I got back there. He sat down, and I sat down. And it was like this showdown also. And I sort of said, Michael, thank you very much for yesterday. And I'm trying to work out what comes next. And if you can be helpful, I'd be grateful. And he'd already seen some of my conducting footage
Okay.
already. So it wasn't, you know, cold.
Yeah.
And so he wrote down, you know, my email address, I think, in his score. I thought, oh, well, that's good, you know.
He's not going to lose that.
Well, so that's, you know, that's going to be a big thing. And then I decided I needed to go a step further. And I thought, okay, so I telephoned the examination schools at Oxford, because I had one more exam to go. And I said, can we possibly move it? Because I'd like to go to San Francisco and see the end of their season.
Oh.
And the university sort of wrote back and said, well, we wouldn't usually allow you to do that, but as this seems important to you, we're going to move your last performance exam. And so the exam was moved, and a friend of mine gave me some money to buy a flight to San Francisco. So I flew off to San Francisco, and I'd already been pestering Michael's assistant, a lovely lady called Marcia Kimes, I think her name was. And she'd arranged for me to sit in the music director's box for the performance. It was Prokofiev, Romeo and Juliet.
Oh.
So I sat in this box. The orchestra played, amazingly well. And I met Joshua, Michael's manager.
Yeah.
He said, would you like to come back and see Michael? I said, yes, please.
Please.
So I got back, and obviously Michael saw me. I said, well, Michael, I've flown halfway around the world to see you, and I'd love to spend some time with you if you can manage. He said, well, look, it's the end of the season. I generally go away. I'm not sure that's going to be possible. So my shoulders shrugged a little bit.
Yeah.
I said, well, look, here's my number. Call me tomorrow. And I called him the following day, and he picked up the phone, and he said, come over and spend the day with me. And I spent the day with him at his house in Pacific Heights.
Oh, wow.
It was a life-changing moment, and that's really how I ended up here in the US. If it hadn't have been for that,
Yes,
for those moments, those absolute, believing I should go do this now,
yeah.
Life would have been very different for me.
Oh, I bet. That's really amazing. He's such a generous person in that, and I can imagine that Discovery Day, obviously, we have them with different people, and sometimes the orchestra is a little bit unaware of actually how much goes into the whole Discovery Day, because some of us might only be involved in the morning rehearsal, and we go, oh, people have come to watch, and then the concert, but actually in between there's usually a whole load of, if it's about a composer, there'll be a whole load of chamber music, the conductor's just giving all these talks, meeting people, and it actually must be quite knackered. But I always thought, whenever we do projects like that with MTT, he's so inspiring and has such a generous nature with sharing ideas and music, and obviously full of amazing stories, which I love. I think that must have been, and for you to just at that point turn around and think, right, I'm off to San Francisco to kind of see him conduct his orchestra. And at the moment, isn't it there, because of course it was his 25th anniversary of being principal in San Francisco, and I just thought, God, this isn't horrible timing when to have such a big celebration. I think they're obviously doing a lot of celebrations online, but my goodness, to have a sort of tenure of that nature, 25 years with an exceptionally top orchestra is sort of unheard of, really. I've got a soft spot for MTT, because he was the first tour I ever did with the orchestra back in 1999 he was conducting, and he was always very friendly to people who were new. If he saw that you were new, he'd certainly try and find out your name, and if he didn't know your name, he'd just be like, hi friend, I'm Michael, how are you, what, and so I have such wonderful memories of him just being this lovely, generous person, and chat, he'll always have a lovely chat or throw a nice dinner for the orchestra and stuff. So obviously the LSO has a huge history with him as well. So that's, I hadn't realized that it literally been a sort of a moment at Oxford, and then a kind of life change to become.
It took a lot of balls on my part to do all that, quite frankly. But I was pretty determined to try and make some sort of change from my time at Oxford to having on the ground real life experience. And so I knew that something like that had to happen, and it takes somebody really to help you. You can't do it.
It's easy being a conductor, because it's not like you can sell yourself as a product, I imagine.
Yeah.
Because I certainly remember when I was a student at the academy, I felt quite sorry for all these young conductors, and I always generally sort of said yes when they wanted to put together some kind of group and just practice, because also just being able to practice your craft cannot be easy. So I particularly remember doing Berlioz' Symphonie Fantastique with Ludwig Morlow, is that in Seattle, and when he was a student, and we sort of read through Symphonie Fantastique with about 7 or 8 people in some practice room, so he could sort of rehearse. And I just remember thinking, actually, this is really hard for the conductors, because you just can't really just be doing your own thing. You really need to rely on the goodwill and helpfulness of your kind of colleagues. So
a lot of goodwill. It's a lot of goodwill you have. I could tell you when you start out, and you have to have moments like that. You have to have moments of actually standing in front of groups and performing in concerts with audiences to know what that's like. One of the big things for me was when you stand on the podium with other conductors. So certainly with Michael, when I went to New World Symphony, he would be stood here and I would be stood there, and he would say, pick up the baton, he would say, it's like this. Mm-hmm. And you would feel the type of preparation and energy that he would give to the beat. And it's all about preparation of what you do, so the players can get a good, hopefully, signpost of what you want them to do. And when you see somebody who's done it 100 times do it, you go, that's how it's done. And I think it's the same, and you can speak much more to this, Maxine, but when you play in an orchestra like the LSO, there are those that have obviously been playing there for a long time, who perhaps carry the orchestral sound. So if somebody new comes in and they sit next to a clarinetist or a flautist or whoever it happens to be, sometimes there can be a sort of a transmission of a way something is played, which is being carried on. And I think that is the same with conductors. If you're fortunate to have all of these different types of experiences, but be around somebody who's been there and done that, the transmission process, if you're prepared to pick it up, and that's another question, can be much more quicker, and then you can start to work out for yourself what works and what doesn't.
No, that is true, because sometimes it's sometimes so hard to even explain how it is. So you just need to be around it, as you say. Sometimes it's just I remember Colin Davis conducting master classes, and gosh, he couldn't even explain what it was, but he'd be sort of the gestures, and suddenly it just sort of worked. And I thought, I don't even really understand, why it's working with him and not with the student. But I know more with, say, when we have students on the LSO string experience scheme and they come in for the first time, and we always put them kind of within a section so they're not feeling a bit out on a limb. And more often than not, the feedback they usually get is to sort of settle themselves into the section, not to be, I'm not even going to say they're too much on the beat, but there's that element of feeling it's within and listening for the wind and brass to breathe it first before you sort of go dunk, right there. And it is something that, and of course they've really done nothing wrong, because they've prepared, they've practiced, and they see themselves as, I'm really on it, I'm right with the conductor. But there's an element of some kind of breathing that happens where you can't really teach that until you're in the thick of it. I think you just pick it up, and some people never do, and for some it's like, this is how it is, and you just lean back into it. It is a strange kind of thing. I mean, I can't imagine how horrendous it must be standing up on a podium conducting an orchestra. I just always think to myself, I don't know why.
Well, I saw a picture of you on the podium the other day, so I thought perhaps you're going to make the transition from, as John Georgiadis did, to,
I know,
first fiddles to podium.
A grade is something else, but no, I couldn't imagine. Just the thought of standing up in front of a group of people who probably, 80 people probably think they know way better than you, and they have very set ideas about the way they want to play. And also, I think sometimes, if you look at an orchestra, it's not that people are angry or anything, but it's the resting face, which is why I always try to, if we have a new conductor or something, I try to sort of look a bit animated, because it's very easy to, your resting face can just look like really unfortunate and challenging. Whereas actually it's not, it's just people sort of taking it in. And I just thought, I just couldn't imagine anything worse than wanting to impose my musical ideas on a group who probably think, no, I don't fancy doing that actually. But
Well, I tell you, I mean, it's a learning process, and conductors are learning all of the time, because there's, even when you come back and look at a piece for a fifth and sixth time, there are still things that you're finding within it, different ways of doing it. But as far as the LSO are concerned, I can tell you that for our audience out there, that the musicians are the most incredible professionals in terms of how they work, and collaborative. And I think that's probably where the orchestra has changed a lot from what I heard from the John Georgiadis days, where they really give conductors a run for their money. There is a collaborative spirit I found within the LSO, and musicians, yes, will have comments about the music that they think that these comments are important, that they are heard, and the conductor should know about them. And
yeah.
but the LSO musicians have a way, certainly with me, of letting me know about those comments in the nicest possible way, which I'm very grateful for. At the end of the day, again, there's a transmission, with the Schubert, the orchestra's played that piece many, many times, and we'll have some comments about it, and it would be improper not to hear those. At the end of the day, it's the musicians that make the music. It's one of the biggest things that I've learned. Musicians that make music, and yes, the conductor is there as some sort of glue, but unless you can allow the musicians to play. I was given some very good advice once by a German manager of an orchestra, who said that the best thing a conductor can do is listen to the spirit of the orchestra. I've never forgotten that. I think that is very true. There's a real good give and take. Colin Davis would always say that it's really about the musicians of the orchestra, and unless you've been through it as a conductor, you don't really know what on earth the person is talking about. The musicians of the orchestra, what was he talking about? What's she talking about? But actually, it's very true. One of the scariest things for me with the LSO was I noticed how, certainly the cello section comes to mind. I'm not going to mention names. How attentive they were to the top of my baton, looking absolutely to the tip, and the amount of information that they obviously hoped that they would glean from that. And that was quite scary, because it shows really that the orchestra can become extremely focused on just that one little tip. And it was something that I learned a lot actually from MTT, and I'm thankful for, about this very clear way of conducting and making sure that everything can come out through the tip. And Colin Davis actually had a wonderful phrase that he was taught by Adrian Bolt, which is that you have to get your juice out through the, and it's a very interesting words perhaps to use, but actually it's very true, because if you can focus all of your energy and information out through the stick, it helps you become quite calm when you conduct, because you don't want to be jumping all over the place. Say you're playing a piece by Stravinsky, and the orchestra wants these very clear, concise moments when the orchestras might be playing very loud, very fast, tempo changes. They want to see some very clear information, I reckon. And, it's quite easy for the conductor to become animated. I could easily become very animated and enjoy the moment, but actually you have to think, no, let the musicians do it, and just be there for them. These are things that I've learned over the past several years, which you can only learn by being on the podium and being put in front of that.
Yeah, totally. Well, somebody here says, I was lucky enough to see the LSO perform Rachmaninoff's second piano concerto a few years ago. I really felt the synergy between the orchestra and the conductor and the soloists speaking to each other. I wonder I'm trying to think who that would have been. Second piano concerto a few years ago. I'm not sure, but I'm glad you enjoyed the concert. Yes, it's such the relationship between conductor and orchestra is such a it's a very, very difficult thing to grasp and understand. Katia, but she wasn't, I think, that really was not that long ago. Yeah, I remember. Oh, she had fabulous gowns.
Right.
That's what I remember. And that was with was that MTT? I can't remember who was conducting. That's terrible. But I think, yeah, certainly the way that we're sort of trained to, I don't know whether it's meant to be, you know, orchestra and conductor, and definitely in John Georgiadis's time, it was probably a battle. And certainly when reading his book, Bow to Baton, there were a lot of, you know, walkouts, conductor walkouts, huge raging scream matches, stuff that just doesn't happen anymore, probably because there's less of the terminology of that style of maestro, that style of, you know, us and him and things like that. Now it is much more collaborative, I think, and you don't, you know, conductors don't rule orchestras with a kind of iron fist. It's much more a feeling of making great music. I mean, what I really remember about the Schubert project you did with us is what a great educator you are, because obviously we did a few takes of this for the education project you were doing, and each time it was just like perfection. I was like, how did you manage to just learn this entire script describing how the music goes, going to the piano, picking out the most important themes, talking about them to camera in such an engaging way, never missing a word or anything. Oh, let's just try that again, and just, it's amazing. Is that something you've always been quite confident about? Oh, thank you. My friend Vic says it was Nazada. Yeah, he's right. I knew. Yep. I was like, oh. Thanks, Vic. But is being a sort of educator and wanting to share and speak and have ideas, like that's something you've always wanted to do, or did that just come organically from projects that you dreamt up?
I think probably organically, and you know, with all of these things, it really requires practice and experience. So the more you do of something, hopefully, the better you become at it. And it's probably no surprising, well, not surprising, that my work really is now in sort of three aspects: conducting, educating, and presenting. And they all fit together very well. But that's because I think of the musicians that I've been around who've done similar things. I mean, MTT does exactly that, and he picked that up, I guess, from Bernstein.
Yeah.
So again, when you see people doing that, now I will tell you that I do enjoy being in front of the camera, and I like feeling that I'm communicating with a lot of people, and I like being able to talk about music in a particular way. For me, being able to impart knowledge in what I call bite-sized chunks is very important to audiences, yeah, to make sure that they can get the message about the piece, because some of these pieces are, you know, incredibly difficult to assimilate, you know, upon a first listening. Mm-hmm. And some are very, very long. So, you know, how can we quickly get the information out there? And so that's something that I work on a lot, to see, you know, what are the key ingredients that I can bring out, a bit like, you know, your favorite recipe or whatever it may be, and how can I quickly get that information out there. And as the orchestra would expect the conductor to be equally prepared when they're on the podium, the orchestra should equally expect, and I hold this true for me to them, that whatever I talk about with them being there is also done at the highest possible level. If you know, I can't get my lines right, how can I conduct through a score, you know? So if you're going to do that, you've got to do it well. And there is a trust thing that goes on with working with musicians. And I found, for me, one of the big things that I learned about myself was being able to trust the musicians, and they need to be able to trust you. And if you find a group that you have a trust for, and they can find some trust in you, that's when magic happens. Mm-hmm. And I just knew with the LSO that whatever I did on the podium, they would do something amazing. And So the trust, there was a trust there that I knew that, well, the music's going to be okay. And then, you begin to develop these other talents. But Opus U, and, this is where really this educational content goes out with, has always been sort of leading with creating online educational content for schools. And it was actually founded by myself, but another person connected with the LSO, not a player, but an amazing man called Klaus Moser, a member of the House of Lords, Lord Moser, and he was chair of the LSO Education Committee. And he was very helpful to me in giving advice. He'd been chair of the Royal Opera House.
Okay.
And was chair of As Consult. He helped a young Daniel Harding starting out. And so Klaus was very supportive of me and was involved in these projects and had a lot of experience. And so we created this, Opus U with Pearson Education, which is a British education company. And I didn't really know much about them at the time, but it turned out they were the world's biggest education company. I thought, well, that's all right. So, and there was an amazing woman there called Marjorie Scardino, Dame Marjorie Scardino, who was CEO of Pearson at the time, and I went to see her and spoke to her about this project. So I have this idea for creating an online music curriculum with a focus on classical music, and she seemed to think that was a good idea, and I thought that was a good idea, and Klaus thought it was a good idea, and so we started creating. And one of the things always at the back of my mind was the idea of live streaming into classrooms. Having the orchestra wherever it may be and streaming them into 2,000, 20,000, 100,000 classrooms. Why not? In this day and age, that's absolutely possible. And so that was always at the forefront of my mind, and I knew that there would be these programs that we would create. And that really has just grown and grown and grown. And so certainly at the moment, when the conducting schedule went out the window because of COVID, the Opus U schedule went through the roof in terms of what was being asked of us. And I'm an optimist and want to see and try and see some good in things. And what this means for music education is that music education from a digital perspective has accelerated way beyond where it would have done if we'd not have had COVID. And
we've just jumped forward so quickly with what we can achieve online, or the fact people have had to just get creative and think about things so much faster than we ever would have, because we were always like, well, that's fine, we can just go to these places, we we have some come in and listen to education projects every month, and the moment that's not happening, it's like, well, the education has to continue. And what you're able to certainly put out has been, that must have been felt like goodness, that we're so glad we have this opportunity to just keep moving things forward.
It's a big deal. And I mean, certainly for us here in California, we were always going to be creating a curriculum for the states. So how it works in the US is that one of the big states, it's California, Texas, or Florida, will call for proposals for a curriculum every sort of 10 or 15 years. And they release what we call new standards. And in this case, new standards for music. And you basically create a curriculum and you present it to the Board of Education, and they decide whether you meet the standards or not. And if you do, then all of the schools are then able to adopt this curriculum. Now in California, there are 25,000 public schools. That's 17.5 million children.
Wow.
And the curriculum that you're creating is going to influence a generation of students. And what tends to happen, whatever is adopted here in California goes out across the whole of the US. And I saw that as the most amazing opportunity to communicate. Now, of course, the curriculum is not all about classical music. There are many different elements of the curriculum that have to be covered, and classical music is probably around 25% of that. But because I am a classical musician, it means that I can make sure that there is a strong voice. I can be a strong advocate for classical music within the curriculum.
Yeah.
And so that's where this, idea of live streaming is going to be pretty amazing, probably give it another year down the line when we are communicating with 25,000 public schools when they're all back. That's a significant responsibility on my part, but I just see it as a way of the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Because even, I mean, we've had to start talking about this because I was very much keen on, you know, it's great what we're doing now, the digital content that we're putting out, but we shouldn't see this as, well, that just stops the moment we are able to be back at work or, you know, going into schools and playing in hospitals and things. We said this could actually have a much wider, far-reaching, idea for the future. There'll be kids that we can't get to, or they can't, bus load to the Barbican to see us, and in which case, actually developing all these ideas are going to be invaluable for the future, and you can reach so many more people, and the enthusiasm we have for music will impact a generation, I hope, anyway, because of course we need young people interested in music to fuel just an entire industry, if you like. But what I've always been impressed with, certainly, the project we did, would it have been almost 2 months ago now, For Lost Songs Strauss project, is how it's a very fine line between making it kids interested and students interested in music without it falling into something really boring that people think, oh, this is not for me, or remotely patronizing as well. It's just because my parents, my mum is a piano teacher, my dad loves music, but his first memory of music was in a school having a lesson, and he will always remember, he was like, oh my God, he said it was so boring. It's just like, put on a gramophone, and he'll always remembers it was like a piece of Tchaikovsky. And he was like, oh, it was so boring. We just found it so, there was no interest in sparking anybody's joy of music and analyzing it in some way. So luckily he came to music much later and loves it. But, it can put whole loads of people off the way that you inform them about something which they might instantly think, well, that's classical music, that's not for me. So I really love the way that you presented, challenging information, stuff that was not like, and I thought, I'm learning something here, but in a very interesting way. So, I mean, I guess it helps if you, as you say, you don't mind being in front of the camera.
Yeah, all of the things that you mentioned are things that I think about all of the time, and I constantly review everything that I do to try and make things as good as I can for the next time. I was pleased that you were able to play some Strauss, and certainly the
you're lucky. That's
solo.
The only thing I've let myself do I think I've only participated 3 times. Once for the LSO, which landed today, obviously online, the Where's Simon. And anyone who's watching this, if you haven't seen it yet, go to YouTube and look on the LSOs.
Just listening, got to go see it. Got to go see it.
But when you don't have proper equipment, and then when you asked me to play the solo from 4 Lost Songs, I thought, I don't know if I really fancy doing that down my phone. But I thought, oh, for Scott, I'll do it. And I've done a project for friends. So, but it was, it was a wonderful, really, really amazing project, and for them to understand, and then it made me understand the thematic material that flows through, and I thought, I didn't really know that before. So I'm being educated by you as well.
Well, I mean, one of the things that we love about our broadcasts is that we invite young K through 12 students to take part in them. And I actually find that the most scary bit for me, because you never know what questions they're going to ask sometimes. And so if I can ever farm those questions off to invited guests to do the hard stuff, then I try to do that. And we had 2 lovely students with us, and they made our lives nice and easy, and you answered a lovely question. upcoming fiddle player.
That's right.
So she wanted to know about Baroque practices and all of those types of things. I thought, oh my goodness, good luck, Maxine. I'm off camera, so it's up to you now uh, to deal with that. But having that mixture of talking to camera, having great musicians around you to help you get the message of the music across, and then having those that are actually consuming it, ask the questions and to gauge their reactions, because when we do these broadcasts and you have invited guests, you can see all of their facial expressions. We're talking about facial expressions in the orchestra. You should see some of the facial expressions of the students when you're talking about stuff. And you think, oh, well, maybe they didn't get that, or yes, no, they got that, or they're excited about this, or this has just gone over their head. I don't believe on dumbing down what we do in terms of the repertoire, that the repertoire is the repertoire. And so, I try and stick to that message, but, try and make it accessible in the best way I can. And there are some pieces that tend to lend itself really well to that, and others that you think might, that don't. Mm-hmm. And so that's been a challenge, but I consider it an almost privilege just to be able to communicate with students, and we know full well that they remember these experiences, as you just spoke about.
Yeah.
If you get it wrong, it's something that they'll remember and could be turned off by it, and so it is a responsibility.
I mean, I guess kids of, say, our generation, well, you're younger than me, my first experience would have been 30 people with a recorder sitting in a hall, and actually you're just thinking, I don't really know what I'm doing, and I just have thing, and I'm going to pretend I'm playing because and there was never much interaction per se, or even if I imagine they, how did you spot anyone with any kind of burgeoning talent or nurture people who actually had a real interest? And I think times have really moved on since then, I hope. Well, actually, while I remember, if anyone's got a question for Scott, just put it in the comments and I can read it out in case you have any questions about being a conductor, being an educator, being I was going to say English person, a Welshman in the US, and being now in wonderful LA. I'm so jealous when I see all your beautiful photos now of your surroundings. Yep. But I think it's just so important, and I suppose it's become more important to me, this whole thing, as I get older. And I'm not someone who is, a lot of people say to me, like, oh, why don't you teach violin? And I'm not confident really about doing that. And B, when life is normal, I just don't really have the time. And what I don't want is to not be there for somebody who, lessons really mean you need somebody to be there all the time, give them the support they need. And that is, if you're 100% in an orchestra, that's not really something you can kind of offer. But this whole idea of giving young people in schools and groups and young orchestras and things more opportunities and the chance to sort of just try and make music or understand music in a fun but educational way just seems to be something that more and more of us can offer. Ooh, there's a question from Jill. What is your opinion on women conductors? Not too contentious, I hope. Yeah, careful what you say, Scott.
Well, I hope, as I was supportive of your elevation to the podium, Maxine, that I'm in favour. And the role of conductor has changed so much over the past 100 years, and I think now it is a much more collaborative spirit between whoever the musician is on the podium and the orchestra, and there is no reason why women cannot conduct just as well as a man can be and be as successful. And they actually probably have some other wonderful leadership qualities that men do not have. Do some
better asking, surely.
So yeah, and I think orchestras around the world are making great strides to ensure that there are women conductors on the podiums. Here in Los Angeles, for example, one of the first orchestras to be doing that with Dudamel Fellows, and other great places around the world. These things just take time to work their way through the system, because certainly for classical music, everything is planned so far in advance. And if you work within opera, as I also do, I was on staff at Chicago's Lyric Opera, things there are planned so far in advance. You think, oh yes, I'd love to do that piece, and they say 5 years time, and you think, oh my goodness. So things take a long time to come through, and we're making great strides.
Oh, my friend Vic, who I have to have a big shout out. Vic Craven is the person who, with Gareth Davis, who's the principal flute of the LSO, basically wrote and created the whole Where's Simon project, which I have to say, Vic took 400 hours to edit that together. So he wants to know, Scott, what is your favourite piece to conduct, and what is the scariest piece to conduct? Oh,
goodness me. So I'm still a huge Haydn fan. I've conducted so many Haydn symphonies, and actually that's not too dissimilar from Simon Rattle, who did a lot of Haydn and still does a lot of Haydn, and pairs it with interesting combinations like Rameau and things like that. So I'm a big Haydn fan. So anything from simple symphonies like the Hen and the Bear and London Symphony and Oxford Symphony. I still get a lot of thrill out of conducting that music. And I know people would expect me to say, well, Stravinsky Firebird, which I love, conducting Stravinsky Firebird, that's great. But I think my tradition still goes back to those earlier pieces of Haydn, Mozart, Mendelssohn, Schubert. They're really grounding pieces for me. In terms of scary pieces, oh my goodness. I mean, I've done a lot of opera. And, opera is very scary because, you're conducting for a long period of time, and you're not only dealing with the musicians in the pit, but also singers on stage. And if anything goes wrong, I mean, it's a challenge to put it back together. And there are some very difficult, given that we've had the overture of Figaro, there are actually some very difficult moments in Figaro. I know it's a well-known opera and everybody knows it. But there are some challenging moments, and even those conductors that have conducted it a million times can sometimes have a few issues with singers on stage and balance and all of these types of things. So all of those things come to mind. But it's very difficult, to ask questions of conductors about favorite pieces, because we tend to be a little two-faced about it in that, okay, it's what piece we're working on at that moment, and all of a sudden, ask it. We'll have a different answer to the question.
And I would have thought nobody will want to admit what a scary one is, because then you're just waiting, like to see when they next conduct. And what was quite interesting, when I watched these talks that Alan Gilbert has done on Facebook, and one of them being with Papano and Marin Alsop and Esa-Pekka. And at one point, Tony just started going, well, guys, I mean, how do you guys approach that bit at the beginning of Don Quixote? Just who here thinks it should be this and that? And they also went, You could tell nobody wanted to sort of admit what they were doing or answer, or it's obviously, I think conductors you don't necessarily want to show, it's a vulnerable way to be conducting a piece, surely, and you don't really want to sort of admit that things are scary, or like, orchestral players will just say, oh my god, the end of Mahler 9 is like really pearly, can't get the bow on the string and stuff. I mean, and nobody really wants to say it, because the last thing you want is everyone going, oh, next time I'll have a look. I'll have a watch. And going back to Jill's question about women conductors, and you're totally right, because of course it is going to take time for, things. There obviously were many less women conductors, because it probably wasn't really ever considered something that many women thought as being a viable real career. I mean, and what I will say is, of course, there are bad men conductors and there are bad women conductors. So it's still going to be a mix. And I hold my hand up to say yes, that I think it is true. Not every woman that picks up a baton is going to be a fantastic conductor. That's just the reality. But it's great for us to be able to have the opportunity and the chance to work with so many different people, and I find that personally really, really interesting to just have, at least what I love about playing in the LSO is, even though we have, say, music director, principal conductor, you don't necessarily work with that person like completely. We have so many guests, so many extra projects, so you see so many different types of conductor and so many different types of people, so that always keeps it really kind of fresh. Have you got any?
I was going to say, I think that's probably where we come from the same sort of background, Maxine, in that, when I started playing a musical instrument, I was a trumpet player first of all, and I did a lot of playing with a youth brass band, and it was more about the socializing element of playing with the group than making the music. The music was the byproduct, but I'd go there really to see my friends because I seem to have a lot in common with these musicians, these young people, even much more so than the school I was attending. I wanted to get to this group to play, and you'd always have a good little chat, and then you'd get down to making music. And for me, it was a very important time. I was, allowed me to travel around different parts of the UK with this group and go off and leave home for a week, in the summer, or 2 weeks. And, I relish that. So I think my music making and yours is about being around people and seeing people, and then making music as the byproduct through that. And that's what I love.
Oh, we have a question from Andres. And now we've got 4 minutes left, so you've got 4 minutes to answer this. How do you deal with the different responses of each orchestra to the gestures? Orchestras in Europe tend to respond later than US orchestras. So you've got 3 minutes now.
Yes. Yeah, what's it? Like Mastermind, the special subject. Never be afraid, when you put the beat down for nothing to happen. And, the stories, of course, are legendary, certainly with the German orchestras, that you could be doing Beethoven's 8th Symphony and you can get to 1, 2, and then maybe they play on 3, and you're hoping it's going to happen with a downbeat like that. Now, I think my secret is not to make a fuss about it, unless it becomes, predominant all of the time. The LSO play a little bit late.
Yeah.
But not like that, on the second or third beat. American orchestras play on the beat, generally, and will happen. But it's a safety mechanism for the players. They see so many different conductors all of the time that actually, if they were to play with half the conductors on the beat, there might be a problem. Not to do a disservice to my colleagues, but everybody conducts very differently, and so it's if the players know when they're going to play and they all breathe. And then you see this like little cushion happen, and then the sound comes out. And so I've sort of gotten used to that, and I quite like having some fun with it if it happens. LSO musicians, don't ever do this to me, please. So I'll die. But it's good actually if you say, okay, this might happen, and then it happens, and then you factor it in, and then I think you try and win the respect, or show the musicians that you've done your homework, and then perhaps they'll feel a little more safer with you, and they'll trust you a little bit more. It's a big trust thing.
Yeah, that's very, very well summed up. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, Scott.
Pleasure's mine.
No, I really enjoyed hearing about how you started and all the stories and things. So I hope to see you either in London or if I come out to LA at some point soon. But stay safe. Have a great time with all the education projects, and I hope you'll be conducting the LSO again at some point soon.
Thank you, Maxine. And for those that, of course, have not seen Where is Simon, go and find it. It's a great clip. Go
to the LSO social media, and it's on the LSO YouTube. And if you've got kids, get them to watch it. It's hilarious and a lot of fun. But thank you so much, Scott, for everything you're doing for education and for being a fun, great person. Take care of yourself.
Take care. Lots of love.
Bye.